the last 4.5, 5 years as a senior pastor at that same church. We were there for about 16.5 years. So it was just an awesome season for us. And then we decided, all right, the Lord was really releasing us from that place, and we said, it's time to move somewhere. So where do we go? And I kind of felt like Abraham, where the Lord said, there's this place you can't spell called Waxahachie. It'll be a nice little home for you. And I was working on my Master's of Divinity through Liberty University, so we could really go anywhere. And the reason why we chose here was because of my family was here. And so we went, we picked up from Maine and we moved down here because we just needed a break in ministry. And then we started attending the Oaks, and one thing led to another, and they asked that I come on staff and take over the Pastoral Care ministry. Because one of the things I quickly found was the Lord just I felt like He had been preparing me my entire life for this season. And it's just been an incredible opportunity for me to use some of the skills. When I was a youth pastor, I think I had been at the church for about 1.5 years. And we had a Christian school, and the headmaster of the Christian school had a massive heart attack. She was rushed to the hospital, and my senior pastor was out of town. And so here I am, this young, 20-something kid, I think it was 21, and I was at the hospital with her husband, who, he was in his 60s, and she was immediately put on life support, and we just kind of walked through those days with him. And it was then that I realized that, first of all, I felt like completely overwhelmed. I don't know what to do. I don't know. I'm sitting in conversations with doctors, and the family's looking at you saying, yeah, do I turn off life support? How do I make this decision, for my wife and for, all of those, that very, very intense time. Just walking through that and feeling like I have no clue what I'm doing. I'm just here. And what I noticed from that point on, which has been true in every single circumstance, myself and John Zarillo, I could still call him today. And he'd pick up the phone and we'd talk. And, we've been out of Maine for a number of years, and he since even has left the church, shortly thereafter. But the relational equity that you build with somebody in the middle of crisis will either strengthen or, in some cases, can really hinder and work against everything you're trying to do as a pastor. So I really saw that when I transitioned from an executive pastor to the senior pastor of that church. And I could do a whole lot of stuff. I could do the song and dance on Sunday morning and preach my heart out. But if I wasn't there at the hospital when they needed that, or if I didn't love and care for them well through those crisis opportunities, then a whole lot of my ministry was missed. And so you're in that, in that environment, and there's really, you could read books, and I tried reading them, and they were just kind of, I don't know, hey, here's how to pray with somebody at the hospital. It's really on the job kind of training that you just kind of pick up and work through. The other major piece is like the whole, pastoral counseling, kind of component of what we do in our position. And if you're moving into, church leadership, then you're going to be one of those frontline people. When marriages are falling apart, 9 times out of 10, they're going to call their pastor first before they, do anything else. And sadly, what I've experienced is when they finally make the telephone call to call even, I think in the last 2 weeks, I would say 8 to 10 people have called the office looking for marriage help. It's like I could be a marriage counselor full time, and and so we have a whole system in place to help with that. But the people that finally reach out and say, "Hey, I really need help with my marriage," it's sometimes too late. Some things have gone on in their life that it's really, really difficult to rebound from. And so we're just, there to love and guide and help them, through that. And so those are the kind of things that we touch in this department. It's kind of, different here in a large church. The other thing that I do a lot is I work, pretty closely with Pastor Scott, because, when people are going through crisis, they really want the senior pastor to respond to that crisis. And so, I've had to learn the skill, even of here, of not taking it personally when somebody says, well, I don't want to talk to you. You're just, the little pastor. And I'm like, yeah, but, the likelihood of you talking to Pastor Scott is not very high, just because of, and not because he doesn't want to, it's just he does not have the capacity or the space to be able to carry the load in that way for people. And so he's, constantly, sending me emails or, text messages to contact certain people and to just show them the care and the love. What I've given you, I just want to go over just a couple of things with you tonight. The first one is that piece of paper, and it kind of says what pastoral care is. Because if I was you and I was coming to the Oaks and the LEAD program, and someone said there's a pastoral care department, I think what I would think of is, well, those are the people that go visit people in the hospital and do a lot of funerals, and I don't know if I want any part of that. That just sounds depressing. And I totally get that, because it's I don't want to say it's scary or intimidating, but it's not the glamorous, upfront kind of ministry that we see on Sunday mornings. Does that make sense? But it's the behind the scenes stuff where I get to love people, and I get to see the testimonies, and I know the rest of the story. There was a couple that they, I don't know if you guys were here yet, this past summer, they featured a couple that had gone through, they'd become volunteers and just gotten really connected to our church. So hearing their testimony on the screen and watching what they've done, and then walking through some of their story with them, I'm going, yes, this is awesome. I walked with them, through a lot of their stuff, and to see them move from, a marriage that was kind of, iffy to where they are now, it's just been absolutely incredible. And you almost get a front row view of what God does on a personal level, instead of like kind of the macro view that other positions or other people have. So how do we do that? A couple things that are on the screen there. These are all the things that they have asked me to oversee. So I'll just kind of briefly go through those. You can read through that later. But basically, I'm responsible for, and our department's responsible for, relational care. And what I mean by that is that's just the hospitals and loving people and just making sure. I want people, my goal is for people who come to the Oaks to be surprised at how much we care. We do that, when like the first guest, stuff, all the cookies, all the things that we do really well on the front end of that. We do that on the level of, when somebody's in crisis. As soon as we hear about it, we want to be able to respond in a very tangible, loving, and real way. And so that encompasses that. The other thing that we oversee, and Josh is mostly in charge of this, is on Sunday morning, we've been doing a ministry team at the end of each of the services. And so we do some periodic training with them. I've given you our manual. I'll talk through some of the stuff in a moment. But I wanted to make sure that you had that so you can begin to develop your skills. Whether or not you're in this department or not, you're going to be ministering with people, and there's some good information with that. Josh was really instrumental in putting a lot of that together. We worked on that hand in hand, and I'm just grateful for him and his growth and in being able to just have input there. So we do the ministry team thing. My goal and my vision is to expand our ministry team all the way through the scope of this ministry. I would love to see at some point a ministry team, and I've been talking with Pastor Joseph and Pastor Joey at our 7 services and even in our Epic services. My end, the best moment for me when I would really, really celebrate is when we would have little kids down in this service praying over adults and prophesying over them. I just think that would be we'd arrive as far as that goes. But we can talk more about that. The Freedom Ministry, you experienced a big portion of that. When we came here, Pastor Scott had a dream of establishing a freedom ministry. And so several of us had gone to Gateway Church in Southlake, and we saw what they were doing there, and we got permission to tweak that and implement it here. And so we've done 2 of those, one last spring and then this last one in the fall, which was just phenomenal. The next phase of that is I will be working this next year at training some people that we're going to call freedom coaches. And so if you went through Freedom Weekend, it was probably awesome, but you probably went, man, there's a little bit more I'd like to pursue in this area. And so we're going to train some people, and it could be some lead students that are interested in that, to be able to meet in a private setting with an intercessor to just lead somebody through those freedom issues. It's not counseling, and so we've got a pretty good roadmap to distinguish between the 2 of those. To help with the marriage issue, we've begun a marriage ministry here. We call it Rekindle, and right now we have a 6-week class that we do, and then in the spring, Pastor Scott is going to do an It Takes 2 series starting in January, and there's going to be 2 big events in the spring. The first is going to be an OAA event that they're going to do toward relationships. And then we're going to do a marriage weekend on February 24th and 25th. And that's going to be like a freedom style, marriage weekend. So we're still that's all I got right now is this freedom style marriage weekend. Between now and then, we're going to put all the pieces to that. And so I've got some in my head, but nothing's been really solidified in there. And then our senior adult ministry, Pastor Brian mentioned that a little bit. We have our traditional service that we oversee. And if you ever need a hug from anybody, please head there on 8:30. And they just love, it's just an awesome room. And in that room are some of my favorite people in this place. They've served the Lord longer than I have been alive. We have a funeral here tomorrow for Frances Robinson. I believe she's been in this church for over 60 years. So think about that for a moment. That's older than probably most of your parents. She has been in this church. And I went and visited her a couple of weeks ago in the hospital, and she was just full of energy and life. And she said to me, she goes, Pastor Brian, she said, I've been trying to help you out. I said, really? I said, what have you been doing? She goes, well, I've been calling all my friends, and some of them, they just don't get to church very often anymore, and they get all bent out of shape over stuff. And I've been telling them, look, I've been going to this church for 60 years, and I haven't been happy with everything that goes on there, but you need to get over it and get back to church. And, just that kind of spunk, and that it's just neat to rub shoulders with those people and really just honor them for everything that they've given and invested in God's kingdom. This enormous building that we are so blessed to do ministry in didn't just happen overnight. This church is 95 years old, and that's an enormous amount of heritage that the Lord has placed into this place. And to rub shoulders with some of those people is a huge privilege. And finally, pastoral counseling. I really should change it to coaching, because I really just hold somebody's hand for a short time, and we have counselors that we connect with, and they do the in-depth counseling. But just be able to meet with folks and evaluate where they're at, try to help them, and just take a step forward through their stuff. So that's kind of what we do. So it's more than just going to the hospital and that kind of stuff. We are I'm in the trenches, with people's lives, and it's an absolutely exciting place to be as we walk alongside people and see them grow and be transformed by the Lord's power. So what I wanted to, you can take this and look through it, but what I wanted to just focus on just for a moment is just give you a tool that I think will be very helpful to you. It's kind of halfway through. There's a chart that looks like this. It says 4 areas of freedom ministry. And I have found this extremely, extremely helpful in just kind of putting some, just helping me define how am I going to approach and minister to somebody that's in need. It's based on Luke chapter 15, and how many of you guys are in hermeneutics? Have you taken that class yet? All right, your hermeneutics professor will not like how I deal with this passage because I call it the allegorical interpretation. I have a master in divinity in theology, and I think it passes the snuff test. But anyway, this is not what Jesus meant when he told these parables. Does that make sense? Okay, so just give me a little bit of a leash to run, and it'll make sense, because I think there are some very powerful things that we can see when you start to minister to others and start to talk to them. And so a couple of questions. You guys are familiar with Luke 15, probably. Jesus tells 3 different stories, and there's 4 different people in those stories. The first one is the story of the lost sheep. Then he tells the story of the lost coin, and then he tells the story of the prodigal son. And so in each of those stories, one of the things that we do is this approach is to ask these different questions. There's a problem in each of those stories. So who or what is lost? What are they like? There's a solution. Somebody searches for it, and then they get out of trouble somehow. And then there are some descriptive elements that really kind of we can draw some things to learn from in how to minister to people. Let me show you what I mean. The first one is the story of the lost sheep, and it'll be up there, but I think you know that, and we won't have to read through it. But in this story, there is a sheep that is lost, and the one that goes out and finds it is a shepherd, and when he finds it, he brings it back and he rejoices over them. But look at what's in there. So in this story, what's lost? There's a sheep. Who is the one that goes and finds it? There's a shepherd. And all the way through the New Testament, there are these connections between Jesus being the shepherd. And so I think you can make a very good parallel there. The good shepherd knows his sheep's voice, and he knows the sheep is missing, and he places great value on it. He leaves the rest and searches for the lost sheep. He places it on his shoulders, and he brings it back. He rejoices over it with his friends. I think that this parallels or illustrates some people who have been entangled in stuff. So when I'm talking to folks and listening to what they're dealing with, sometimes it hasn't been like overt rebellion. They haven't turned their back on the Lord and ran away. They just kind of drifted. Maybe stopped spending time with the Lord, maybe got interested in some things and just really drifted away from the Lord, got entangled in sin, and they just got entangled in stuff. And so I think it's interesting that Jesus is the one that's pictured here who comes to their rescue. When somebody's entangled, and if you think of a sheep that is caught in the thickets or picks up a whole bunch of stuff, they just need tender care to be able to restore them to that place. And so how do we deal with entanglements? We recognize that the source and all those things are all kind of freedom terms that are there. We renounce them, and we replace the truth that is there and come into agreement with the Lord. You can see it even a little bit further as we move across there. The next story is the story of a lost coin. And in that story, the thing that's lost is a coin. It's not, I kind of describe it, I guess maybe like if you're fans of the movie Toy Story, and you put some emotion on this poor little coin that's dropped behind this dresser or wherever. And that really represents those who have been wounded in some way. Does that make sense? And I think it's beautifully pictured here that the person who comes and finds it is, in this story, is a woman who comes and searches and brings that restoration to that lady in that situation. And I'm not trying to say that the Lord or that God is a woman, but if you think through and work through all the theology stuff, you can really see that there are some nurturing qualities that the Lord brings to those who are wounded. And if you're ever talking with somebody who has been abused or is trying to process through that abuse, that there are some very descriptive words in there. The woman is a gentle nurturer. She lights a lamp. I think that illustrates bringing a revelation of truth. So when somebody is wounded and dealing with, especially like sexual trauma, they need the light of God's word to come and say, look, it wasn't your fault. There's truth that needs to be applied to that. They need to understand it and see that truth. She sweeps the house clean. She removes all the filth and the pain. And then she rejoices over that again and brings restoration to that. The next story is the story of the prodigal son. And in that, God is pictured as a father. The person that's lost chose to go on themselves and rebelled against the Lord, or rebelled against his father. And the difference there between somebody that's entangled and somebody that is in rebellion is that they need to respond to the father. Is my thing not working? You good? Okay. And in this story, the one that goes and finds them is God the Father. He runs and he kisses him, and he gives him a ring. He restores his position. He gives him sandals. He rejoices over him with restoration. And so all of that begins to happen in that. And then the third one there is the ungodly beliefs, and again that's the older brother in that story, and God is pictured as a father again. And so there are people that have some messed up beliefs about who God is. And so as I'm talking with somebody and meeting with them, this is one of the filters that I use to just kind of grasp where they're at and the things that they're dealing with. And then from there, I can begin to help guide them and figure out how to minister to them effectively. Does that make sense? So I think we're probably good. You want to do some? Yeah.
It's a bit hot in
It
here.
is warm, and these lights are not happy. Sorry, guys. Any questions? I think we can open it up for questions, Brian.
Yeah, any questions?
Either over this or over what? Pastoral care stuff.
Some good ones here in a second, Brian. Just take
All right. Yes.
So when you are with like a family, someone's just passed away, and they bring up the question, why does God allow this to happen? How do you respond to that?
That is a good question, and something. Yeah. So if you didn't hear her, what happens when you're there and they ask the question why? Usually I'm pretty honest, and I say there's no answer to that question. And I'll go one of a couple different ways. Sometimes I'll say something like, even if I could give you a definitive answer, if I could even ask God right now, why did Frances pass away at 91 years old? I mean, we could all sit there and say, well, hey, man, she was 91 years old. She lived a long life. Things were great. We could all make up these excuses. But at the end of the day, none of them are good enough to overcome the pain that I'm experiencing about the loss. Does that make sense? And the trap is to try to get to the point of making an excuse or making God's sovereignty understandable in that moment, and that is absolutely impossible. Does that make sense? You just cannot do it. And so sometimes I'll even say, you just kind of read, what they're looking for. And I've said many times, look, there is no answer that's going to satisfy this. But I do know this, God is with us. Psalm 23, we've just gone through all of that. God is with us through every moment. He feels the pain that we're going through, and let's reach out to him in this moment and ask him to bring his comfort into this situation. One of my go-to Bible stories is when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. I like that story because, Jesus kind of knew what he was going to do through that whole process. And he's making his way into Bethany. And both Mary and Martha come to him and they say, look, if you had been here, then my brother wouldn't have died. And that's a pretty audacious statement to make, an accusation. Does that make sense? I mean, that's a pretty in-your-face, bold kind of statement. And folks that are walking through the pain of losing someone that they love often are in that kind of emotional state. So I tell them, look, you can ask God these hard questions. And then I also point out, look at how Jesus responds to them in that passage. He doesn't get mad and say, oh, Mary or Martha, check out what I'm going to do in the next 30 seconds. He doesn't, kind of dismiss them and even get angry at them for daring to challenge the Lord and say, if you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. What's his response in that passage? You guys, who knows that? Come on. Yeah, the shortest verse in the Bible is 11:35. And Jesus wept. He doesn't answer any of those questions. All he does is he weeps, so much so that John and the rest of those that are with him, they marveled at his response. Does that make sense? And so when you're in the middle of that situation, I've shared that story countless times because that's what Jesus, that's what he does. And so it's his presence that's more important than the answer to the question. And that's been a really powerful skill that I've had to learn, is really just to keep my mouth shut and just be present, to be Jesus with some skin on in the middle of that moment, and just be with them and love with them and cry with them and just pray a whole bunch in the Holy Spirit under my breath, to just invite God's presence into that room, into that situation, because that's what I'm called to do, and that's what I've got the privilege to do in that moment. And it drives me nuts because I'm an answer kind of guy, and I'm always thinking like, oh, I should say this, or should I use this verse, or should I use that? And I guess through experience, I've tried that several times, and that does not go as far as just being there and loving them through the process. Yeah.
So in the pastoral counseling / pastoral coaching that you were talking about, what's typically like the boundary before you hand them off to professional counseling?
So I said this earlier in our staff meeting. I am one of the few people I think that is allowed. Well, first of all, let me talk about this. Typically, by and large, you should never counsel with somebody that's the opposite sex, okay? And so here's where I draw that boundary. One, I will meet with a female by myself in my office once. My wife knows, she's got full access to my calendar, and so she knows exactly when I'm meeting with somebody. My secretary, she's got full access to my calendar. She knows as well, and it's a pretty public place, so that's fine. I think now, back up 20 years when I was first starting to be a youth pastor, that would never take place. Does that make sense? So there's some maturity in that, and you have to be very, very careful of that. One of the rules that my wife and I have had, really up until I became senior pastor, was that we just were never alone with somebody of the opposite sex. I remember, calling my wife several times after a youth group saying, guess what, so-and-so's here, and it looks like she's going to be left alone until her parents come and pick her up. And she'd wake up our little Emily and drag her to the church, because that's how committed we were to that. And it was just when everything falls apart and you're still there, so that's very, very important. It's a very important boundary to maintain in ministry. And then one of the things that we do here at the Oaks, which really, really helps me, is we used to have a counseling department, and several years ago that spun off, and the person that was ahead of that left and started her own practice. And so what they have done budget-wise is they pay for 3 sessions for most everybody as long as I'm within budget. So I have a line item in my budget that allows me to pay for 3 sessions of counseling for folks. And man, that's just been brilliant. I wish I would have thought of that, back up in Maine, because that's really helped. So what I do is really just facilitate that. I meet with them usually once, maybe twice. My wife and I will do marital counseling together, or coaching as we like to call it, and we'll do probably about 3 or 4 sessions. But we don't deal with infidelity so if there's been an affair or something, I very quickly send that off, because that's out of my expertise and wheelhouse. It's very, very difficult to come back from that. So really, so my role, I'll meet with somebody a couple of times, usually once, and then we pass them off to counseling. So I'm trying to build, with that Freedom Coach, track that I'm trying to establish, is I want to be able to train some of our, ministry level lay people to be able to assist in that and to fill that gap. To be able to meet with them once or twice and coach around a couple different issues. Maybe do some freedom issues, and then if they still need help after that, then we can, bring in the professional counselor.
Hey, Brian, can Josh talk for a couple of minutes about
Yeah.
his experience? And then while he's talking, can you think about a good response to the question on how to address change with the older generation that, been here
Yeah.
maybe a few decades? How to go about that as a leader of the organization while you're talking, Josh?
Well, I started in this department over a year ago now. Started back about late August of last year. And since that time, I've grown in my faith in my own personal life. If you would have told me 2 years ago that I'd be in the place that I am now, I would have probably laughed and be like, no, I won't be there. I think God really had a plan. And through this internship, I've really been able to grow, been able to learn a lot about what it takes to help people. Whether it's visiting someone in the hospital and they could be terminally ill, or if it's someone who broke their leg and is there for a few days. Really, it's what I boil it down to is be Jesus to people, and it's be the hands and be the feet, be the mouth sparingly, only as the Holy Spirit directs you. But just with everything, being able to be on the ground level, so to speak, on some things like the ministry team, like Freedom Weekend, or Freedom Quest, rather. It's just been it's been an honor, really, to be a part of everything that God is doing here at the church, and just being able to be open and be honest with Pastor Brian and be like, hey, this is this is something I'm taking care of, or this is something that I can open up to Pastor Brian in my own personal life and say, hey, I'm struggling with this. Do you have any advice, or do you have any wisdom on this? And that's the kind of relationship that we've been able to kind of have, and that I know a lot of people have with the pastors here. And just like in care and being in pastoral care, I've learned so much, and Pastor Brian has given me a lot of grace in that to work and to do things like the ministry team, and to help with things like our new believer process, and just knowing everything. Well, not everything. I don't know everything, but just being able to be there for people and being able to visit someone in the hospital is one of the greatest things. It can be one of the hardest at times, but it's one of the things that gives me the most fulfillment in my life. I almost every week, every Sunday, I'll take a second and I'll look around at everything that God is doing, And it's just, like, I feel fulfilled. I feel like I know where I am. Or like I know that God has me where I am. And I know where I'm supposed to be. And it's right here. And so, for a while I've known that I want to be a pastor. And I didn't really know how to do it. But care and pastoral care is one of the most pivotal and one of the most influential on me things that I've ever learned. And I didn't know how to do a hospital visit before I came here, before I started here. I was like, okay, hospital visit, yeah, let's go talk to sick people. It's so much more than that. It's being there. It's being the church to them. It's being a physical representation of who the Oaks is, or even who Jesus is. I met with a guy a few months ago that he didn't know God, and he was in the hospital. It was a long story situation, but all in all, I was able to witness to him. And that right there is one of the things that it brings me so much joy to talk to people and to meet with people, to meet them where they are, and meet any need that I can. And so, just, in my experience in this internship, it's one of the best things for growth that I've ever had. So.
Thanks, Josh.
Yeah, so to wrap things up, to answer Pastor Brian's question, so yes, we've got a unique situation here. They've had a traditional service, I think, since they moved into this campus. And if you swing by there, it depends on how you like the worship style in the church that you came from. But I remember for me growing up, all those songs that they sing in there on Sunday mornings are the ones that they were singing in my church when I was growing up as a kid. So I know them all. And they have they have some very strong opinions about worship and worship style. I just met with, we're doing that funeral tomorrow, and we were trying to get the organ to work, and they were very disappointed. Well, first of all, they were happy that we had an organ, but they were very disappointed because it just wasn't up to his standard. And they had some very, very strong opinions about what worship looks like and about what a move of the Lord looks like. So, they've been through a lot. They've walked with the Lord through many different seasons. And a lot of them look back to the revivals when they first came to know the Lord. And that's kind of like the high water mark. And if we're not careful, that's what we all do. We all have an ideal or a perception that we think it looks like when God is moving. Does that make sense? And you guys are kind of developing that now and through that sense. And, so it's no fault of this generation. That's what when they say, man, did God move? Well, if people weren't at the altar, and some of the stories that you hear of, them literally laying out sawdust and, so when people fell out in the Holy Spirit, they didn't bonk their head on the concrete floor. I mean, that's their experience with the Lord. And so you have to be careful with honoring that, but yet bringing them, continuing to keep them connected to the church. So I don't know if that helps. Is that good? I think the biggest thing is just honor. And that's what I try to do, with that group, and just to honor them, love them, let them know that they still have something to contribute to His kingdom, even if it's just praying. And if you can get one of those people that have been following the Lord for 60-something years to pray with you, my goodness, there's just nothing better than that, because they've just spent a lifetime learning how to just be intimate with the Father. And so there's so much to glean from that.